The veteran had just settled into the cramped middle seat when the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Flight 447 to Denver, cleared for takeoff. Please return immediately to Gate 7. Emergency protocols in effect. Passengers exchanged worried glances. The flight attendant who had moved him looked pale as she grabbed the phone. Medical emergency, someone whispered. Mechanical failure, suggested another. The elderly man in 23B simply closed his eyes and waited. 20 minutes passed before the jetway reconnected with a metallic thunk. The cabin door opened and two figures in military dress uniforms stepped aboard. A four-star general moved down the aisle with purpose, his aide scanning seat numbers behind him. The general stopped at row 23, and his eyes found the veteran immediately. Without hesitation, he snapped to attention and rendered a crisp salute. Sir, General Morrison, Joint Chiefs of Staff. I apologize for the delay, but we had to intercept this aircraft. Every head in the cabin turned. The flight attendant, who had been so dismissive 30 minutes earlier, now stood frozen in the galley, her face drained of color. The businessman in 23 stared openly. Children pressed against windows to see better. The veteran slowly returned the salute from his middle seat. Hello, Jim, he said quietly. I told you this wasn't necessary. The general shook his head firmly. With respect, sir, when a Medal of Honor recipient gets bumped to economy, it becomes very necessary. The general's voice carried throughout the cabin as he addressed the veteran. Colonel William Harrison, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, and Congressional Medal of Honor. The passengers listened in stunned silence as the list continued. Purple Heart with 3 oak leaf clusters. Combat Infantryman Badge. Master Parachutist Wings. The flight attendant gripped the galley counter, her knuckles white. She had treated a Medal of Honor recipient like a second-class passenger, demanding he move to economy because of a fabricated computer error that never existed. General Morrison turned toward the crew. This man saved 200 Marines in Fallujah when his convoy was ambushed. He held off 3 enemy squads for 6 hours while calling in air support. When his radio went down, he ran through machine gun fire to reach another position. The aide handed him a folder. His classified operations remained sealed, but I can tell you he served with distinction in 7 combat deployments. The businessman in 23 slowly stood and began clapping. Others joined until the entire cabin erupted in applause. The veteran raised his hand gently. Please, that's not necessary. I was just doing my job. The general's expression hardened as he looked at the airline crew. Sir, our military liaison network monitors travel for security purposes. When your system flagged Colonel Harrison's seat change, we were notified immediately. A Medal of Honor recipient being moved from first class triggered automatic protocols. The general extended his hand toward the aisle. Colonel, if you would allow me to escort you back to your proper seat. The veteran shook his head politely. Jim, I'm perfectly fine here. These folks have been kind to me. But the businessman in 23A was already standing, gathering his belongings. Sir, please take my first-class seat. I insist. The flight attendant who had moved him stepped forward, her voice trembling. Colonel Harrison, I sincerely apologize. I had no idea who you were. There was no computer error. Management told us to move passengers to accommodate a corporate client. The veteran studied her face with understanding eyes. You were following orders. I understand that better than most. General Morrison helped gather the veteran's small carry-on bag. The passengers watched as they made their way toward first class, many reaching out to shake the colonel's hand as he passed. Thank you for your service, whispered an elderly woman. A young Marine in civilian clothes stood at attention as they walked by. The captain emerged from the cockpit, his face flushed with embarrassment. Colonel Harrison, I served under your command in Afghanistan. Lieutenant Peterson, Bravo Company. You probably don't remember me, but you saved my life during that IED attack in Kandahar. The veteran smiled warmly and shook his hand. I remember every Marine, son. How's your family doing? As Colonel Harrison settled into first class, Captain Peterson returned to the cockpit to begin pre-flight procedures. The engines spooled up normally, but as they pushed back from the gate, warning lights began flashing across the instrument panel. The co-pilot frowned at his displays. Engine 2 is showing anomalous readings, temperature spikes, and pressure fluctuations. Peterson's voice came over the intercom, measured but tense. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor technical issue that requires our attention. We'll be returning to the gate while our maintenance team investigates. The passengers groaned collectively, but General Morrison leaned forward in his seat, concerned. 20 minutes later, the captain emerged from the cockpit again, this time looking genuinely worried. He approached the general and colonel quietly. "Sir, we have a problem. The engine management system is malfunctioning, but our diagnostics can't isolate the fault. Ground crew has been working on it for an hour with no success." Colonel Harrison looked up from his book. "What type of aircraft, son?" "Boeing 737-800, sir." The veteran nodded thoughtfully. "Military version is the C-40 Clipper. I spent considerable time with those systems during transport operations." Peterson's eyes widened. "Sir, our lead mechanic says he's never seen anything like this. The computer systems are fighting each other, creating cascading failures." General Morrison watched the exchange with growing interest. The colonel had more than just combat experience. The ground crew chief climbed aboard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Captain, we've run every diagnostic protocol twice. The engine management computer keeps resetting itself, but we can't find the source code causing the loop. Boeing's sending a specialist, but he won't arrive for 3 hours." Passengers were growing restless. Some demanded to be moved to other flights, but the gate agent explained that mechanical delays had created a domino effect throughout the system. The airline faced potential losses in the hundreds of thousands. General Morrison studied the colonel's expression. "Bill, you mentioned transport operations." The veteran closed his book slowly. "I worked with modified C-40S during special operations. We integrated different avionics packages for classified missions. Sometimes civilian and military systems don't communicate properly." Captain Peterson leaned closer. "Sir, what kind of modifications?" The colonel looked thoughtful. "We had to patch civilian flight management systems with military-grade navigation computers. Created interesting conflicts between the two operating systems. Sometimes they would fight for control, especially during engine parameter monitoring." The ground crew chief looked skeptical. "With respect, sir, but this is a standard commercial aircraft. No military modifications." Colonel Harrison smiled slightly. "Son, I helped design the integration protocols Boeing uses for government contracts. The same base code runs in both systems. Sometimes a software update can trigger old compatibility issues that never got resolved." The ground crew chief hesitated, then made his decision. "Sir, would you mind taking a look? We're running out of options here." Colonel Harrison followed him off the aircraft, General Morrison close behind. The maintenance bay buzzed with frustrated technicians staring at diagnostic screens filled with cascading error codes. The lead mechanic looked up as they approached. "The engine management system keeps defaulting to a military protocol we've never seen before. It's like the computer thinks it's on a different type of aircraft entirely." The colonel examined the diagnostic readout, his fingers tracing patterns across the screen. There, he pointed to a specific line of code. "Legacy subroutine from the C-40 integration package. Boeing never fully removed it from the civilian firmware. It's dormant until triggered by specific temperature and pressure combinations." The mechanics exchanged glances. "How we fix it?" Colonel Harrison rolled up his sleeves. "We need to access the deep system architecture and manually override the military protocol. But it requires bypassing 3 safety lockouts simultaneously. The timing has to be perfect, or we could damage the engine permanently." The maintenance supervisor shook his head. "Sir, company policy prohibits unauthorized personnel from accessing aircraft systems." The colonel nodded respectfully. "I understand. But in 30 minutes, that engine is going to overheat beyond repair. Then you'll have a 200-passenger problem and a $20 million engine replacement." The maintenance supervisor looked at the temperature readings climbing steadily toward the red zone, then at Colonel Harrison. "Sir, what do you need?" The veteran moved to the diagnostic console with practiced efficiency. Two technicians on the bypass controls, one monitoring engine parameters, and someone to cut power if I signal. His fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing system levels the maintenance crew had never seen. The first safety lockout disengaged with a soft chime. General Morrison watched with fascination as the colonel worked through protocols he had helped develop 20 years earlier. Temperature holding steady, called out the first technician. Pressure normalizing, reported another. The colonel's hands moved with surgical precision through the second lockout sequence. The error codes began disappearing from the screens one by one. Final override in 3, 2, 1. The military protocol subroutine vanished from the system architecture, replaced by clean civilian code. The engine management computer stopped its endless reset cycle and settled into normal operation. The maintenance bay fell silent except for the steady hum of properly functioning systems. The ground crew chief stared at the diagnostic screen in amazement. Engine 2 showing all green across the board. Temperature nominal, pressure stable, all parameters within normal limits. The colonel stepped back from the console, wiping his hands on a maintenance rag. That should hold you for the flight. Boeing will need to issue a firmware patch eventually. Word spread quickly through the passenger cabin as Colonel Harrison returned to his seat. The businessman from 23A approached him as he settled in. "Sir, we heard you just saved this flight." The veteran shook his head modestly. "The maintenance crew did all the hard work. I just pointed them in the right direction." But Captain Peterson had a different perspective when he made his announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to the expertise of Colonel William Harrison, we've resolved our technical issue and will be departing shortly. This man didn't just serve our country with distinction. He just prevented what could have been a catastrophic engine failure." The flight attendant who had originally moved him to economy appeared at his seat, tears in her eyes. "Colonel, I don't know how to apologize for how I treated you earlier. You could have let us sit here for hours, but instead you saved all of us." The veteran took her hand gently. "You were doing your job. I was doing mine." Passengers throughout the cabin turned to look at him with new understanding. The elderly woman from economy class had been moved to first class by other passengers who insisted she sit closer to the hero. A young father approached with his daughter. "Mister, my daddy says you're like a superhero. Can I shake your hand?" General Morrison smiled as he watched the transformation. An hour ago, these same people had watched this man be humiliated and said nothing. Now, they understood they were in the presence of someone truly extraordinary. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, General Morrison leaned toward Colonel Harrison. "Bill, I never got the full story about your transition to civilian life. What have you been doing these past 5 years?" The veteran smiled quietly. "Consulting work mostly. Helping aerospace companies integrate military and civilian technologies." The general's eyebrows raised. "You mean you've been solving problems like this regularly?" The colonel nodded. "Boeing, Lockheed, Northrop Grumman. When they run into compatibility issues between government and commercial systems, they call me. Most of the time it's remote work, but occasionally I have to get Hanson." A well-dressed woman in the seat across the aisle had been listening. "Excuse me, are you William Harrison from Harrison Technical Solutions?" The veteran turned, surprised. "Yes, that's my company." She extended her hand. "Jennifer Walsh, VP of Engineering at Raytheon. We've been trying to reach you for months about a Navy contract issue." Captain Peterson's voice came from the cockpit door. "Colonel, I just spoke with Boeing Maintenance Control. They want to know if you'd be willing to brief their engineering team about today's fix." Apparently, this isn't the first time they've seen this problem, but no one could figure out the root cause. The passengers around him began to understand they weren't just traveling with a war hero, but with someone who had become a legend in the aerospace industry. The quiet man they had watched being humiliated was actually one of the most sought-after technical experts in the country. As Flight 447 reached cruising altitude, the airline's regional director boarded through a connecting gate in Chicago during their brief layover. He approached Colonel Harrison's seat with a folder in hand and genuine contrition on his face. "Sir, I'm David Chun, Regional Operations Director. I've come to personally apologize and make this right." The colonel looked up from his book. "That's not necessary. Your crew handled everything professionally once they understood the situation." But Chun shook his head firmly. "Sir, what happened to you today violated every principle our airline stands for. We've reviewed the incident thoroughly." He opened the folder. "Colonel Harrison, we're upgrading you to Lifetime Chairman's Circle status, our highest tier. Unlimited first-class upgrades, priority boarding, and dedicated customer service. Additionally, we're implementing mandatory training for all staff about recognizing and properly serving military veterans." General Morrison nodded approvingly as Chun continued. "The employee who moved you has been suspended pending investigation. We've also established a protocol requiring supervisor approval before any military personnel can be downgraded from their purchase seats." The businessman from 23A overheard and stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we should give Colonel Harrison a proper thank you." The entire cabin erupted in sustained applause. Flight attendants joined in, and even the cockpit crew emerged to participate. Colonel Harrison stood and waved graciously, but his expression remained humble. "You're all very kind, but I just did what anyone with the knowledge would have done." Flight 447 touched down in Denver exactly on schedule, a minor miracle given the morning's events. As passengers prepared to disembark, many stopped by Colonel Harrison's seat to thank him personally. The young father's daughter handed him a drawing she had made during the flight, showing him fixing the airplane with a cape flowing behind him. Captain Peterson made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you witnessed something extraordinary. Colonel William Harrison didn't just serve our country with distinction in combat. He served all of us today by preventing what could have been a tragic mechanical failure. His quick thinking and expertise saved lives." As they walked through the terminal, General Morrison shook his friend's hand. "Bill, you know this story is going to spread through every military base in the country by tonight." The colonel chuckled. "I was hoping for a quiet flight to visit my grandchildren. Instead, I got a reminder of why I love serving." The passengers dispersed to their connections and final destinations, but many would later share the story of the humble veteran who was treated poorly, then saved their lives with quiet dignity and extraordinary skill. Within hours, social media buzzed with first-hand accounts of the legendary colonel who turned a potential disaster into a lesson about hidden heroes. Have you ever witnessed someone being judged unfairly, only to discover their incredible background later? Share your story about hidden heroes you've encountered in the comments below. The flight attendant's voice cut through the boarding chatter like a blade. "Sir, you need to move to economy immediately. There's been a computer error with your seat assignment." The elderly man in 2A looked up from his newspaper, confusion flickering across his weathered face. He held up his boarding pass, showing first class clearly printed. "Ma'am, I purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago. Everything appears to be in order." But she was already reaching for his carry-on bag, her tone growing more aggressive. "Sir, I don't have time to argue. We have a corporate client who needs this seat. You're being moved to 23B in economy." Other first-class passengers watched the confrontation with uncomfortable silence. A businessman across the aisle shifted nervously but said nothing. The flight attendant's nameplate read Jessica, and her impatience was palpable as she tapped her tablet impatiently. The veteran studied her face for a moment, then quietly closed his newspaper and began gathering his belongings. "Of course, I understand you're just following orders." His calm dignity seemed to make Jessica even more irritated as she waited for him to collect his things. As he made his way down the narrow aisle toward economy, other passengers barely glanced up from their phones and magazines. The elderly man with silver hair and steady hands found his middle seat between a businessman and a college student, neither of whom acknowledged his arrival. He settled in without complaint, reopening his newspaper as if nothing had happened.